The waiter laughed before Evelyn Cross had even reached the hostess stand, and that single laugh would cost him more respect than he could imagine. The sound carried across the glowing dining room just as she stepped in from the cold Manhattan rain, her faded black velvet coat damp at the shoulders, her old crimson scarf hanging loose around her neck like something rescued from another decade. A few heads turned immediately. Not because she caused a scene, but because she looked completely out of place among the polished marble floors, gold pendant lighting, and women draped in silk dresses that probably cost more than most monthly rents in the city. Evelyn noticed the stare from the young hostess first. Then came the quick glance downward at her worn leather boots. Then the smile. Tight. Professional. Artificial. The kind designed to say no politely before words ever arrived. "Can I help you?" the hostess asked carefully, already assuming she was lost. Evelyn removed her rain-speckled gloves slowly, her fingers lined with age and faint ink stains that never quite washed away. "Reservation for Cross," she said quietly. The hostess typed the name, paused, then looked up again with visible confusion. "Oh." Another pause. "Right." Behind her, one of the waiters leaned toward a coworker and muttered loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "Guest thrift stores take reservations now." A few guests laughed into their wine glasses. Not loudly. Just enough. Enough for Evelyn to hear every word. She didn't react. That almost made it worse. The waiter expected embarrassment. Maybe anger. Instead, she simply stood there beneath the amber light, expression unreadable, as if she'd heard comments like that her entire life and stopped caring years ago. The hostess forced a smile and grabbed 2 menus. "Right this way." But instead of leading Evelyn toward the elegant center dining room where the skyline shimmered through 30-foot windows, she guided her toward a cramped corner beside the kitchen doors where servers rushed past carrying trays of sea bass and filet mignon. A couple seated nearby exchanged glances the moment Evelyn sat down. The woman whispered something behind her hand. Her husband smirked openly at Evelyn's old concert shirt visible beneath the coat. Then came the second humiliation. A waiter approached with a polished smile that never reached his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, glancing deliberately at her scarf and boots, "our dining room usually maintains a more elevated dress standard during evening service." The words landed softly, but the surrounding tables heard them immediately. Conversation slowed. Silverware paused midair. Someone near the bar let out an uncomfortable chuckle. Evelyn looked up at him for a long moment. Calm. Tired. Observant. "I see," she said quietly. "Would you prefer I leave?" The waiter gave a little shrug designed to avoid responsibility. "That's entirely your decision." More eyes turned now. A young couple near the windows looked embarrassed for her. An older man smirked into his bourbon. The tension spread table by table like smoke under a door. But then something strange happened. Evelyn's gaze drifted past the waiter toward the black and white photographs lining the restaurant walls. Her expression changed almost invisibly. Not hurt. Recognition. She stood slowly and walked toward one framed photograph near the piano, ignoring the whispers rising behind her. The waiter rolled his eyes. "Ma'am, please don't touch the artwork." But Evelyn had already stopped in front of the largest photograph in the room. A grainy black and white image of a young unknown chef standing outside a tiny Brooklyn kitchen in winter, cigarette smoke curling into the night air beside him. The restaurant called it the image that built the chef's empire. Evelyn stared at it silently. Then, almost to herself, she whispered, "You cropped the left side." The waiter frowned. "Excuse me." She tilted her head slightly, eyes fixed on the frame. There used to be a woman standing beside him. A hush fell over the nearest tables. The waiter laughed again, sharper this time. "And I suppose you knew the photographer too?" Evelyn finally turned toward him, rainwater still glistening faintly on her silver blonde curls. "I was the photographer." And somewhere near the kitchen entrance, a tray hit the floor. The tray shattered against the marble floor so loudly that conversation stopped across the entire dining room. Wine glasses trembled. A fork clinked against porcelain somewhere near the bar. Every head turned toward the young sous chef standing frozen beside the kitchen doors, his face completely drained of color as he stared at Evelyn Cross like he had just seen a ghost walk in from the rain. The waiter who had mocked her forced out an awkward laugh and folded his arms. "Right," he said smugly. "And I photographed Frank Sinatra too." A few nervous chuckles followed, but they died quickly when the sous chef suddenly rushed forward. "Miss Cross?" he asked breathlessly. His voice cracked slightly. "You are Evelyn Cross, the Evelyn Cross." The shift in the room was immediate. Not dramatic. Worse. Subtle. The kind of silence that creeps in when people realize they may have misjudged someone important. Evelyn looked at the young man carefully, as if searching through decades of faces. "I know you," she said softly. "You worked at Leclerc before it closed." The sous chef nodded too quickly. 3 years. Pastry station. His hands were trembling now. The waiter frowned, confused by the sudden tension. "Wait, you actually know her?" The young chef ignored him completely. "Chef Moretti keeps your book in his office," he said quietly to Evelyn. "The black one with the cigarette burns on the cover." Nearby tables exchanged confused looks. Someone whispered, "What book?" Evelyn gave a tired half-smile. "That old thing should have disappeared years ago." But the sous chef shook his head immediately. "No. He calls it his Bible." Now even the hostess looked nervous. The waiter's confidence began to crack around the edges. He glanced toward the giant framed photograph again, suddenly unsure of himself. "Look," he said defensively, lowering his voice, "if there was some misunderstanding, I was only trying to maintain standards." Evelyn turned toward him slowly. Not angry. Somehow that made him even more uncomfortable. "Standards are important," she said calmly. "Especially in places built on appearances." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. A woman near the piano quietly lowered her wine glass. Another guest subtly pulled her chair back from the conversation, sensing something larger unfolding beneath the surface. Then came the hidden clue none of them had noticed before. Evelyn stepped closer to the photograph and lightly touched the lower corner of the frame. "The original was cropped after the magazine bought it," she said. The chef hated the woman standing beside him because she told him he looked scared. The sous chef stared at her in disbelief. "No one knows that story." Evelyn looked at the photo again, eyes distant now. "Because no one remembers the people behind the camera." The waiter swallowed hard. His arrogance was fading fast, replaced by the slow panic of a man realizing the room was no longer on his side. Before he could speak again, the heavy kitchen doors swung open. Heat and noise spilled briefly into the dining room. Then silence followed behind a tall man in a white chef's coat stepping onto the marble floor. Frank Moretti rarely left the kitchen during peak dinner service. But the moment his eyes landed on Evelyn Cross standing beneath that photograph, he stopped walking entirely. The color disappeared from his face. One of the line cooks behind him whispered, "Chef." But Frank Moretti did not answer. He just stared at the woman everyone else had laughed at 5 minutes earlier, and for the first time that night, the entire restaurant understood that something enormous had just changed. Frank Moretti had spent 20 years building the kind of reputation that made powerful people wait months for a reservation, but the moment he saw Evelyn Cross standing beneath that photograph, he looked less like a celebrity chef and more like a man staring straight into his own past. The entire dining room watched him carefully now. Wealthy investors paused mid-conversation. Influencers lowered their phones. Even the pianist near the bar slowed his hands across the keys as an uneasy hush settled over the room. Frank stepped forward slowly, his white chef coat still dusted faintly with flour from the kitchen. "Evelyn," he said quietly, almost disbelieving the sound of her name. The waiter's face tightened instantly. He looked between them, searching for reassurance that this was somehow still under control. But there was none. Frank stopped only a few feet from Evelyn, his eyes drifting toward the old photograph on the wall. "I thought you were in Prague," he murmured. Evelyn gave a small shrug beneath her faded velvet coat. "That was years ago." Frank let out a breath that sounded almost nervous. Nobody in the restaurant had probably ever seen him nervous before. "You disappeared." The words lingered in the warm amber air. Nearby guests leaned subtly closer without meaning to. Evelyn looked past him toward the dining room windows where rain streaked softly against the glass 30 stories above Manhattan. "Sometimes people stop wanting to be seen," she said. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. The hostess lowered her eyes. One of the socialites who had laughed earlier suddenly looked deeply interested in her untouched champagne. Then Frank noticed where Evelyn had been seated. Beside the kitchen doors. His expression darkened immediately. He turned toward the waiter. "Who sat her there?" Nobody answered at first. The young waiter tried forcing confidence back into his posture. "She did not exactly look like she belonged in the main room," he muttered carefully. "Wrong answer." Frank stared at him for 3 full seconds. Not angry. Worse. Disappointed. "Do you know why half this city came to my first restaurant?" he asked quietly. The waiter swallowed hard. Frank pointed toward the photograph. "Because she took that picture." Several guests exchanged startled glances. Frank continued before anyone could speak. "Nobody knew my name back then. I was cooking in a broken kitchen with pipes leaking over the prep station." His voice carried across the room now. Calm. Controlled. "Food magazines ignored me. Investors laughed at me. Critics never showed up." He looked back at Evelyn. "Then one night she walked in carrying a camera older than my entire staff." Evelyn gave the faintest smile, almost embarrassed by the attention. "You looked terrified in that alley." A few nervous laughs rippled through the dining room, but Frank did not smile. "I was terrified," he admitted. "And she turned that fear into the photograph that changed my life." The waiter's face had completely lost color now. The room itself seemed to tilt socially around him. Guests who had laughed earlier now looked uncomfortable even making eye contact with Evelyn. One man quietly straightened his suit jacket as if suddenly aware of how shallow everyone in the room must appear. Frank looked toward the hostess stand. "Cancel table 12. The manager blinked. "Sir, that reservation belongs to Senator Whitmore." Frank did not look away from Evelyn. "Then the senator can wait." A murmur spread instantly through the restaurant. Status had just shifted in real time, and everybody felt it happen. Frank personally pulled out a chair near the panoramic windows overlooking the city lights. "The best table in the restaurant." "Please," he said softly. "You should have been sitting there from the beginning." Evelyn studied him for a moment, then glanced once toward the waiter still standing frozen near the marble pillar. Her tired hazel eyes softened slightly, but not with pity. More like recognition. She had seen this kind of arrogance before. Usually in people too desperate to belong somewhere important. And somehow, that made the entire room even quieter. The energy inside the restaurant changed so completely that even the servers began walking more carefully, as if one wrong movement might shatter whatever invisible tension had settled over the room. Frank Moretti guided Evelyn toward the panoramic corner table himself, ignoring the stunned expressions from guests who had waited months for that exact seat. The city glowed beyond the glass behind her, rain streaking silver across the skyline while candlelight flickered softly against the worn velvet of her coat. Nobody could stop staring at her now. That was the irony. 10 minutes earlier they wanted her gone. Now every eye followed her movements with restless curiosity. The socialites near the piano whispered furiously behind manicured hands. One man quietly searched her name on his phone beneath the table. Another guest leaned toward the sommelier and murmured, "Who exactly is she?" Frank heard the question. "Someone all of us." "Oh, more respect than we realized," he answered without slowing down. The waiter remained near the marble pillar, completely abandoned by the confidence he wore earlier. He looked smaller now somehow. Younger. His forced arrogance had dissolved into the sick realization that he had humiliated someone deeply connected to the very image this restaurant depended on. Evelyn noticed him glancing toward the exit twice already. Like he wanted to disappear before things became worse. But things were already worse. Because nobody was laughing anymore. Frank pulled out the chair beside the window. "Please." Evelyn sat slowly, placing her old leather gloves beside the candle. Frank remained standing for a moment, almost uncertain what to say next. That alone unsettled the staff. Powerful men like Frank Moretti were never uncertain. "You should have called," he finally said. Evelyn gave a faint tired smile. "I did not think you would remember me." Frank looked genuinely wounded by the statement. "Remember you?" He glanced toward the photograph across the restaurant. "Evelyn, half my career exists because of you." The nearby tables fell even quieter. A woman in diamonds slowly lowered her champagne glass, suddenly aware how shallow the room had become only minutes earlier. Evelyn looked down at the menu without opening it. "People only remember the face attached to success," she said softly. "Not the people standing in the rain holding the camera." Frank pulled out the chair across from her and sat down personally, another shocking breach of restaurant protocol. The manager near the bar looked visibly nervous now. Celebrity chefs did not sit with guests during peak service. But Frank ignored everything around him. "You vanished after Chicago," he said quietly. Evelyn's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the candlelit tablecloth. "After Daniel died, photographs started feeling dishonest." Frank's expression softened immediately. Several staff members exchanged confused looks. They had never heard Frank speak this gently to anyone. Evelyn stared out toward the rain-covered skyline again. "Everybody wanted images of beautiful moments," she continued. "Nobody wanted photographs of grief." The room seemed to absorb those words in silence. Even the waiter looked down at the floor now. Somewhere behind the bar, a glass slipped slightly against polished wood. No one spoke loudly anymore. The restaurant no longer felt like a place built on status. It felt like a room full of people suddenly confronting how quickly they judged appearances. Then another shift arrived. An older couple near the center dining area stood from their table unexpectedly. The husband walked slowly toward Evelyn, his face pale with disbelief. "Excuse me," he said carefully. 20 years ago, did you photograph the Winter Street concert at Madison Square Garden?" Evelyn looked up at him. "Yes." The man let out a stunned breath. "I still have that photograph in my office." More guests turned now. Another voice near the bar spoke up quietly. "Wait. Evelyn Cross." The recognition was spreading table by table, and the waiter who mocked her could only stand there frozen while the entire restaurant slowly realized the woman they treated like she did not belong had shaped pieces of culture hanging inside their own homes. By now, nobody in the restaurant was pretending not to watch anymore. The atmosphere had shifted into something strangely intimate, like an entire room of strangers had stumbled into a story they suddenly realized mattered more than themselves. Phones slowly disappeared beneath tables. Conversations faded into murmurs. Even the jazz pianist seemed to soften his playing, as though the night itself had become quieter around Evelyn Cross. Frank Moretti remained seated across from her, his elbows resting lightly against the white tablecloth while servers moved nervously around them. The manager kept glancing toward the entrance as if expecting an important investor or critic to walk in at any moment. But the real pressure was already here. It sat calmly beside the rain-streaked windows wearing a faded concert shirt beneath an old velvet coat. The waiter who mocked her stood near the service station pretending to polish silverware that had already been polished 3 times. Every few seconds his eyes drifted back toward Evelyn. Not with arrogance anymore. With fear. Because the room had stopped seeing him as confident. Now he looked cruel. And people hated recognizing cruelty in places designed to feel elegant. Frank noticed the silence spreading through the dining room and leaned back slowly. "Do you know what happened after that photograph?" he asked quietly, looking towards several younger guests nearby. No one answered. Frank gave a faint humorless smile. Reservations tripled in 48 hours. A few surprised murmurs followed. He pointed toward the framed black and white image across the room. "Investors called me non-stop. Food magazines suddenly wanted interviews. Everyone acted like they discovered me overnight." His eyes returned to Evelyn. But none of them understood the photograph itself. Evelyn finally opened the menu, though she barely glanced at it. "You looked exhausted," she said softly. "People trusted that." Frank laughed quietly under his breath. "I had slept 4 hours in 3 days." "Exactly." A subtle smile touched Evelyn's face for the first time all night. "Perfection is forgettable. People remember honesty." Those words landed heavily in the room. A woman seated near the bar slowly lowered her eyes, clearly thinking about the moment earlier when she laughed at Evelyn's clothes. Across the restaurant, the hostess shifted uncomfortably beside the reservation desk. The social pressure was turning inward now. Nobody wanted to admit how quickly they judged appearances. Frank studied Evelyn carefully. "You still see things nobody else notices." Her expression dimmed slightly at that. "That used to feel like a gift." The sentence hung there quietly. Frank understood immediately. Most people in the room did not. Then the hidden truth surfaced a little deeper. After Daniel passed, Frank said carefully, "You stopped taking photographs completely." Several nearby guests looked stunned. One younger server whispered, "She quit." Frank nodded faintly without taking his eyes off Evelyn. Every gallery in New York wanted her work. She walked away from all of it. Evelyn traced one finger lightly along the rim of her untouched water glass. "Grief changes the way you frame the world," she murmured. The room fell silent again. Not uncomfortable this time. Reflective. Because suddenly the old coat and tired eyes made sense. She was not invisible because life had defeated her. She had simply stopped performing success for people who only respected appearances. The waiter's face tightened as that realization spread through the dining room. He had mistaken quiet pain for weakness. Frank leaned forward slightly. "Do you know how many photographers would kill to have your legacy?" Evelyn looked around the restaurant slowly. At the expensive dresses. The polished walls. The people who worshipped appearances without recognizing substance standing right in front of them. Then she gave the faintest shrug. "Legacy is a strange thing," she said softly. "Most people only recognize it after they have already disrespected it." No one at the nearby tables could even look directly at the waiter anymore. The humiliation should have ended there. For most people, the room falling silent and a powerful chef publicly honoring them would have been enough. But the night was not finished exposing who people truly were. A senior investor seated near the center dining area suddenly stood and approached Frank Moretti with the careful confidence of someone accustomed to influence. His tailored charcoal suit looked freshly pressed, his silver cufflinks catching the candlelight as he lowered his voice. "Frank," he said quietly, though half the restaurant could still hear him, "the Whitmore party is waiting outside. If you delay them any longer over this situation, it may create unnecessary complications." The wording was deliberate. This situation. Not this guest. Not Evelyn Cross. Just a situation that needed to disappear neatly so the powerful people could return to feeling comfortable. Frank's expression hardened immediately. But before he could answer, Evelyn spoke first. "It is all right," she said softly. "Important people should not be kept waiting." A few guests looked relieved hearing that. Others looked ashamed of feeling relieved. Frank stared at her carefully. "You still do that?" Evelyn looked up from the candle flickering between them. "Do what?" "Make everyone else comfortable after they disrespect you." The sentence landed like a quiet blade across the dining room. The investor shifted awkwardly. The waiter near the service station stopped pretending to polish silverware entirely. Evelyn gave the smallest shrug. People panic when status becomes uncertain. Frank leaned back slowly, studying her weathered face beneath the warm restaurant light. "No," he said quietly. "People panic when they realize character and appearance are not the same thing." Another silence followed. Heavier this time. Because everybody understood the truth in it. Then the restaurant doors opened again. Senator Whitmore entered surrounded by two sharply dressed associates, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere near the entrance. The hostess straightened instantly. Several guests turned with excitement. Cameras quietly emerged again. But the senator barely made it 3 steps before noticing Frank sitting at a guest table instead of managing the dining room. "Frank," he called with practiced charm. "You are making us feel unwelcome tonight." Frank did not stand. "You can wait a few more minutes." A visible ripple spread across the restaurant. Nobody spoke to Senator Whitmore that way. The senator's smile tightened slightly before his eyes drifted toward Evelyn sitting by the window. At first he looked confused. Then suddenly his expression changed completely. Genuine surprise crossed his face. "Wait," he said slowly. "Evelyn Cross." The room shifted yet again. Evelyn looked almost amused now by how recognition kept arriving in waves. The senator stepped closer, disbelief softening his political polish for the first time. "You photographed my wife and daughter 15 years ago at St. Catherine's Hospital." Evelyn nodded faintly. "Your daughter hated the camera." Whitmore laughed under his breath. "She was terrified after surgery." His expression softened with memory. "You made her smile in less than 2 minutes." Several guests exchanged startled looks. This was not the glamorous celebrity photographer story they expected. Whitmore looked around the restaurant slowly before speaking again. "That photograph still hangs in our home." Then came the final shift. He turned toward Frank and asked quietly, "Why is she sitting here alone while half this room acts like she does not belong?" Nobody answered. Not the hostess. Not the waiter. Not the investors. Because suddenly the room could see itself clearly. All the polished appearances. All the social performance. All the instant judgment based on fabric, posture, age, and silence. Evelyn looked around the dining room one last time, her tired hazel eyes reflecting the Manhattan lights beyond the glass. "It is not personal," she said softly. "People only see value once other important people confirm it for them." And judging by the silence that followed, nobody in the restaurant could deny she was right. The dining room never fully recovered from that moment. Even after conversations cautiously resumed and servers continued delivering plates beneath the golden light, the atmosphere remained altered, as though everyone inside the restaurant had become painfully aware of how quickly human beings assign worth to appearances. Senator Whitmore eventually took his seat across the room, but not before stopping beside Evelyn one last time. "My daughter still talks about that photograph," he said quietly. "She said you were the first adult who looked at her after surgery without pity." Evelyn lowered her eyes slightly at that. "People heal better when they are not treated like broken things." The senator nodded slowly before walking away, leaving behind another wave of silence. Frank Moretti watched him go, then turned back toward Evelyn with an expression somewhere between gratitude and regret. "You always did that," he murmured. "You saw people before they saw themselves." Evelyn looked out through the rain-soaked windows at the blurred Manhattan lights. "That used to matter more." Frank studied her carefully. It still matters. But Evelyn did not answer. Because deep down, she no longer fully believed it. The restaurant staff moved differently around her now. Every server became overly polite. The hostess could barely maintain eye contact. One young busboy nearly dropped a stack of plates because he kept glancing nervously toward her table. Yet somehow, the exaggerated respect felt almost as uncomfortable as the earlier humiliation. Evelyn noticed it too. The sudden transformation. The way people changed once status entered the room. That was always the disappointing part. Not the mockery itself. The speed of the reversal. Then came the moment nobody expected. The young waiter finally approached her table. Slowly. Carefully. His earlier confidence had disappeared completely. Up close, he looked exhausted now. Embarrassed. Human. Several nearby guests immediately fell silent again, pretending not to listen while listening to every word. Frank's jaw tightened slightly, ready to intervene if necessary. But Evelyn simply looked up calmly as the waiter stopped beside her candlelit table. "Miss Cross," he said quietly, his voice uneven. "I owe you an apology." The room seemed to lean toward him collectively. He swallowed hard. "I judged you before I knew who you were." Evelyn held his gaze for several seconds. "No," she said softly. "You judged me before you thought I had value." The distinction hit him visibly. Harder than anger would have. The waiter lowered his eyes. "You are right." Evelyn glanced around the restaurant slowly. The designer dresses. The polished marble. The carefully curated luxury surrounding them. "This place teaches people to perform importance," she said quietly. "That can make young people cruel without realizing it." The waiter looked stunned she was not humiliating him back. "I am sorry," he repeated. "Truly." Evelyn studied his face carefully, then gave the faintest nod. "Good. Nothing more. No dramatic speech. No public punishment." Somehow that made the moment even heavier. Because everyone nearby understood she could have destroyed him socially if she wanted to. Instead she chose restraint. The kind powerful people rarely practiced. Frank leaned back in his chair slowly, almost smiling now. "You just gave him a lesson most people never learn." Evelyn reached for her water glass. "Maybe." Then she glanced toward the giant black and white photograph across the restaurant wall again. "Or maybe tomorrow he laughs at someone else wearing old shoes because another room tells him it is acceptable." The waiter's face tightened painfully. Because even he could not promise she was wrong. The jazz piano continued softly in the background while rain tapped gently against the towering windows, and for the first time all evening, the restaurant no longer felt glamorous. It felt honest. A room full of people quietly confronting versions of themselves they did not particularly like. By the time dessert menus arrived, the storm outside had softened into a thin mist drifting across the Manhattan skyline. The city lights beyond the glass looked blurred now, almost dreamlike, their reflections stretching across the polished marble floors in long ribbons of gold and silver. Inside the restaurant, conversations had returned, but quieter than before. More thoughtful. Nobody laughed loudly anymore. Nobody seemed eager to perform sophistication for the room. It was as if Evelyn Cross had accidentally stripped something artificial away simply by existing exactly as she was. Frank Moretti stood beside her table one final time before returning fully to the kitchen. "You know," he said quietly, "I spent years trying to build a restaurant important people would admire." Evelyn looked up at him beneath the warm candlelight. "And did it work?" Frank glanced around the room slowly. The expensive suits. The carefully rehearsed elegance. The guests now pretending not to stare at her every few minutes. He gave a faint tired smile. "Tonight I am not so sure anymore." Evelyn folded her weathered gloves carefully into her lap. Places become dangerous when appearance matters more than humanity. Frank nodded once. Deeply. Like someone finally hearing a truth he had avoided for years. Then he left her alone by the window at last. The waiter approached one final time carrying her check with careful hands, though everyone knew Frank would never allow her to pay for dinner. "Miss Cross," he said softly, "I just wanted to thank you for accepting my apology." Evelyn looked at him for a moment before taking the receipt folder. "Do not thank me yet," she replied gently. "The real test is how you treat the next person who walks in wearing old shoes." The young waiter lowered his eyes. Immediately. Not humiliated this time. Humbled. There was a difference. Evelyn slipped on her faded velvet coat slowly while the entire restaurant pretended not to watch her prepare to leave. But they were watching. Every single one of them. The hostess near the entrance straightened nervously as Evelyn approached. "Good night, Miss Cross," she said quietly. This time there was no artificial politeness in her voice. Only sincerity. Evelyn gave a small nod and stepped toward the doors. Then she paused beside the giant black and white photograph hanging near the piano. The image that launched Frank Moretti's empire. The image people admired without ever knowing who stood behind the lens. For a few seconds, she simply stared at it silently. Older now. Tired now. Almost invisible to the modern world moving too quickly around her. Yet somehow still carrying more substance than most of the room combined. A young woman seated near the bar suddenly stood and approached carefully. She could not have been older than 23. "Miss Cross?" she asked nervously. Evelyn turned slightly. The girl hesitated before speaking again. "I am studying photography." Her voice shook a little. "I almost quit last month." Evelyn studied her face quietly, recognizing something familiar there. Doubt. Exhaustion. The feeling of becoming invisible before your life had even fully started. "Do not chase being noticed," Evelyn said softly after a long pause. "Just learn how to truly see people. Almost nobody does anymore." The young woman nodded slowly, eyes glassy with emotion. Then Evelyn stepped outside into the cool Manhattan night. No dramatic exit. No applause. Just the soft sound of rainwater beneath old leather boots as the restaurant doors closed behind her. But long after she disappeared into the city lights, the room remained unusually quiet. Because somewhere between the candlelight, the polished marble, and the expensive wine, a room full of strangers had been forced to confront a difficult truth. The people society overlooks are not always ordinary. Sometimes they are simply tired of explaining their worth to shallow rooms.